It's funny how we just completely take the truly vital, invisible things for granted. Like, think about the physical house you live in, right?
Yeah.
You walk into the kitchen, you turn the faucet, and water comes out. You fill a glass, you drink it, and you just move on with your day.
You never think about it.
Exactly. You absolutely do not think about the municipal water mains running beneath the street or, the pressure valves at the reservoir or all that intricate PVC hidden behind your drywall. You just expect the water to be there.
Yeah, until it isn't.
Right. Because the very moment a pipe bursts inside those walls, suddenly that invisible plumbing is the literal center of your universe.
Oh.
Because, well, it's currently flooding your living room and ruining your hardwood floors.
And threatening the structural foundation of your entire home, honestly. It's perfect parallel, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, because financial systems operate on exactly that same principle of invisible reliability. When it works, it's just the background hum of modern civilization.
Like swiping a credit card.
Exactly. You swipe a card to buy a coffee in Tokyo, and the funds are pulled from a checking account based in London. The transaction clears in milliseconds. Nobody blinks.
The barista just hands you the coffee.
Right. The system just works, quietly and efficiently, relying on millions of unseen digital valves and automated clearinghouses.
But, and here is where we get to the core of today's deep dive. What if the city isn't just dealing with a random burst pipe? What if the city council, the mayor, and all the neighboring towns have suddenly aggressively decided to just dig up the streets, tear out all the interconnected pipes, and build their own completely separate, incompatible water systems?
Which is an absolute nightmare scenario.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this, because today we were taking a deep dive into the literal plumbing of the global economy. And the people who monitor the pressure gauges, like the absolute highest levels of global finance, they're telling us that the pipes aren't just cracking. They're being intentionally dismantled.
Yeah, and the resulting flood isn't going to be localized to one neighborhood or, one sector. We are looking at a system-wide overhaul.
Driven by some incredibly intense geopolitical pressures.
Absolutely. It fundamentally rewrites how money moves across borders.
And we have a massive stack of sources today to guide us through this. Our primary anchor for this deep dive is a presentation from the World Economic Forum dated June 4th, 2026.
Right.
It examines a joint report they co-authored with the management consulting firm Oliver Wyman. And the title of the report alone sets a pretty heavy mood. It's called Deepening Divides, the Cost of a More Fragmented Financial System.
The thesis they put forward in there is, well, it's staggering.
Staggering is the right word, because they are projecting that the breaking of our global financial plumbing could result in a $6 trillion hit to global GDP.
Yeah, $6 trillion.
$6 trillion. To put that into perspective for you listening, they are explicitly stating this economic impact would be worse than the craters left by both the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic.
Which is a profound, almost unthinkable claim to make. I mean, the 2008 housing collapse and the 2020 pandemic shutdowns redefined the global economy entirely.
Totally. But our sources today go way beyond just one WEF report. We are analyzing a real-time snapshot of the economic and geopolitical zeitgeist of mid-2026.
Yeah, we're looking at warnings from market legends about a looming global monetary reset.
Deep analyses on shifting supply chains, the physical draining of gold and silver from major commodities exchanges, and this is a big one, massive demographic shifts that are just colliding with this financial fragmentation.
It's a lot of moving parts.
It is. So our mission today is to take all of this towering macroeconomic theory and figure out what it actually means for you right now. We aren't just going to stay up in the clouds talking about, high-level banking compliance.
Right, because that gets dry fast.
Yeah, we want to understand how a multi-trillion-dollar fragmentation is going to ripple through your wallet, your career trajectory, and frankly, the futures of every single generation.
From boomers all the way down?
Exactly. We're talking about boomers trying to figure out the math on their Social Security, all the way to Gen Z and Gen Alpha, who are entering a completely fractured, walled-off economic landscape.
It is a systemic shift in the most literal sense. And you really can't talk about a systemic shift of this magnitude without looking at the raw underlying data of our current global tensions. Finance doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's a direct reflection of geopolitics.
Which brings me to a very important point before we dive into the deep end here. The snapshot of sources we are analyzing today includes some highly charged, highly polarized political topics.
Right, some very sensitive stuff.
Yeah, for instance, we have economic analyses running the raw numbers on how much Donald Trump has, quote-unquote, cost America in terms of trade and policy shifts. We also have geopolitical strategists like John Mearsheimer in these sources making pretty chilling predictions about NATO facing a stunning defeat in Ukraine.
Which are intense claims.
Very intense. So I want to stress to you, the listener, that in this deep dive, we are absolutely not taking any political sides. We are not endorsing any of these specific political viewpoints, nor are we validating their political conclusions.
Exactly. Our job is strictly to impartially report on the content provided in these sources.
Right. We are analyzing these data points objectively to understand the broader anxiety, the structural math, and the global instability that is actually driving this financial fragmentation.
And that's a crucial distinction for us to maintain. We have to look at these headlines and these specific geopolitical analyses as symptoms of a broader macroeconomic condition.
Because the market doesn't care about our feelings.
Right. The global market doesn't care about our personal politics. It reacts to the friction these events create. And that friction, whether it's from a trade war, a kinetic war, or just a policy shift, is exactly what is stressing the financial plumbing to its breaking point.
Okay, so let's start breaking down this $6 trillion warning. We need to define our terms clearly because we hear the word fragmentation thrown around a lot by pundits. But what does it actually look like in practice? What exactly is the plumbing of global finance?
Well, let's trace a dollar to understand it. When we talk about financial plumbing, we are really talking about the hidden mechanisms of clearing, settlement, and cross-border payments. Let's go back to your Tokyo coffee shop example.
Right.
If you have an account in New York and you buy something in Tokyo, your bank in the U.S. doesn't just put a physical $100 bill in an envelope and mail it to Japan.
Obviously not.
Right. There is a complex, digitized correspondent banking system. Your bank communicates with a larger intermediary bank, which communicates with a Japanese intermediary bank, which then credits the coffee shop.
So it's like a relay race.
Exactly. And the agreed-upon language that allows these banks to talk to each other securely and instantly, that is heavily reliant on systems like SWIFT.
SWIFT, which stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. Right? I always assumed, honestly, that SWIFT was some giant vault in Switzerland holding all the money.
You're not alone. That's a really common misconception. But SWIFT is not a bank. It holds zero funds and manages no accounts.
Weird, really?
Yeah, it is essentially an incredibly secure, standardized email service. Banks use it to tell each other, hey, I am sending you this much money. Please credit this specific account, and here are the compliance details.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And for decades, this system has been highly centralized, highly standardized, and largely built around the US dollar as the primary reserve currency. It's the standardized threading on the global financial pipes.
So the pipes all fit together perfectly no matter what country you're in.
Precisely. But the WEF and Oliver Wyman report brings together a panel of heavy hitters to point out that this standardized threading is currently being forcibly stripped.
Who's sounded the alarm here?
We have experts like Matt Strahan, the private market initiatives lead at the WEF, and Daniel Tannenbaum, the global anti-financial crime practice leader at Oliver Wyman.
Okay.
We also have insights from Ann Walsh, the chief investment officer of Guggenheim Partners, and Daniel Massimile, the chairman of Nedbank.
So these aren't just fringe internet theorists.
Not at all. These are the institutional managers who operate the actual valves of the global economy. And their collective warning is that countries are beginning to build their own parallel, completely incompatible messaging and settlement systems.
Okay, but I want to push back on this $6 trillion figure for a second, because it sounds almost hyperbolic. Is a $6 trillion projection just a sensational scare tactic to get policymakers to actually read a white paper?
It sounds like it, right?
Yeah. I mean, let's think about the 2008 financial crisis. In 2008, the U.S. housing market collapsed, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, the global credit market literally froze. Nobody was lending to anybody. It felt like the entire capitalist system was going to stop breathing.
It was terrifying.
And then, a decade later, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, where the global physical economy essentially turned off the lights for a year, supply chains halted, planes stopped flying.
Right.
So how on earth is financial fragmentation, which frankly just sounds like a back-end administrative IT headache, how is that worse than the entire global economy shutting down?
Well, it comes down to the fundamental difference between a temporary blockage and structural destruction. 2008 and the COVID pandemic were profound shocks to the system. In 2008, toxic mortgage-backed securities clogged the pipes. The banks lost trust in each other because they didn't know who held the bad debt.
Right.
But the underlying architecture, the SWIFT system, the desire to trade in dollars, the whole globalization framework that was universally agreed upon, nobody wanted to tear that up.
They just wanted it fixed.
Exactly. The central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, came in like emergency plumbers. They used a tool called quantitative easing, which essentially means they created massive amounts of liquid capital out of thin air to buy those toxic assets and flush the system out.
So they basically poured $1 trillion of liquid Drano down the sink to get things moving again.
That is a very apt metaphor,
Really?
yes. The pipes were fine, they just needed to be cleared.
And what about COVID?
Similarly, COVID was a massive physical supply and demand shock. People stopped buying services and started buying goods, which snarled physical shipping lanes. But the digital infrastructure of finance was exactly what kept us afloat.
Oh, because it allowed governments to distribute stimulus checks instantly.
Right, and it allowed remote workers to get paid across borders. The financial plumbing saved us during COVID.
I see where this is going. If fragmentation isn't a clog, it's a structural failure.
Yes. What the WEF report is highlighting is that fragmentation is the intentional dismantling of the system itself. If a pipe is clogged, a central bank can flush it with liquidity. But if a nation-state decides to rip the pipes out of the wall,
Just tear them right out.
and replace them with 10 different proprietary systems that legally and technologically refuse to connect with the original network, no amount of central bank money printing can fix it.
Wow.
The $6 trillion hit to global GDP doesn't come from a sudden, dramatic overnight crash. It comes from the immense, compounding daily friction introduced into every single global transaction.
So it's basically death by a billion paper cuts.
Think about the sheer cost of inefficiency here. If every single cross-border payment suddenly requires extra compliance checks because of competing sanctions,
Right.
different digital currency conversions, entirely new legal frameworks, and routing through third-party neutral countries just to avoid triggering a geoeconomic penalty, the velocity of money slows down drastically.
Because everyone's just filling out paperwork instead of doing business.
Exactly. When money moves slower, businesses can't invest as quickly, trade deals take longer to finance, and the friction eats up all the profit margins. A $6 trillion loss is what happens when the entire planet suddenly has to pay a massive administrative toll just to do business with each other.
Okay, that clarifies things immensely. It's a clogged pipe versus taking a sledgehammer to the foundation of the house.
Right.
But, nobody just wakes up and takes a sledgehammer to their own living room without a compelling reason. There's immense external pressure causing this, which brings us directly to the geopolitical forces driving this fragmentation.
Yes.
Our sources heavily highlight historian Neil Ferguson's 2026 declaration. Welcome to Cold War II.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Niall Ferguson's framing of Cold War II is really the skeleton key to understanding the why behind this financial fragmentation.
How so?
Well, let's look at the first Cold War. We had a bipolar world. The Soviet sphere of influence and the Western sphere led by the United States. They were ideologically opposed, possessing nuclear arsenals, but economically they were largely decoupled.
Right. The West traded with the West. The Soviet bloc traded with the Soviet bloc.
Exactly. If a crisis happened in Moscow, it didn't immediately bankrupt a factory in Ohio because their supply chains were fundamentally separate.
But the era we all grew up in, the last 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, has been the exact opposite of that.
Completely.
We lived through this era of hyper-globalization. The prevailing theory in the 90s and 2000s was that, if everyone is trading with everyone, if the supply chains are inextricably intertwined, a major war becomes economically suicidal and therefore impossible.
That was the defining doctrine of the era, and it led to a period where corporate efficiency and relentless cost reduction were the only metrics that mattered.
Right, making things as cheap as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Supply chains became incredibly fragile, but incredibly cheap. You mined raw materials in Africa, manufactured the semiconductors in Taiwan, assembled the final smartphone in China, designed the software in California, and sold it in Europe.
It was a marvel of global plumbing.
It was. But what we are seeing now, as highlighted extensively in the WEF podcasts, is the aggressive, unapologetic return of geoeconomics. There is a specific phrase used in the sources that we really need to dissect. The rise of industrial policy, meaning governments are back in the business of business.
Let's hover on that phrase for a second. Governments are back in the business of business. Because in the 90s and 2000s, the ideal was free markets, rapid deregulation, and letting multinational corporations find the absolute cheapest labor anywhere on the planet. But now we are seeing massive tariffs, strict export controls on advanced technology, and governments explicitly subsidizing their domestic industries to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars.
And they are doing it out of panic. The sources point to intense global instability driving this industrial policy.
Like what?
Well, we have mentions of the Hormuz crisis and the Iran oil shock. We have the financial research outlet Bloomberg warning that available global oil could literally run out by July due to geopolitical choke points.
Wow.
We have Ian Bremmer from the Eurasia Group talking on the Diary of a CEO about a brutal 2026 shift and a geopolitical crisis they simply cannot stop.
So when a country looks at the Strait of Hormuz getting shut down, or a war in Eastern Europe disrupting grain and natural gas, they suddenly realize that cheap smartphones aren't worth much if they can't keep the lights on or feed their citizens.
Exactly. All of these geopolitical flashpoints have revealed the fatal flaw in the hyper-globalized model. Efficiency is fantastic for corporate profit margins, but it is an absolute nightmare for national security.
Because you're dependent on everyone else.
Right. If your country relies on a geopolitical rival for your energy grid, for your basic antibiotics, for the critical minerals in your military tech, or for access to the financial clearing system, you are structurally vulnerable to coercion.
This means countries are looking at the US dollar and the SWIFT system and realizing it's not just some neutral, benevolent utility, it is an active weapon.
This is where Daniel Tannenbaum's role at Oliver Wyman as a global anti-financial crime practice leader becomes highly relevant to our deep dive.
How so?
Over the last decade, the West, and particularly the United States, has increasingly used the financial plumbing to enforce its foreign policy. Instead of sending aircraft carriers, we use financial sanctions.
Right.
If a nation breaks international law or threatens an ally, we cut their banks out of SWIFT. We freeze their central bank reserves held in Western jurisdictions. From a Western security standpoint, it's a brilliant, powerful, nonviolent tool.
But if I'm putting myself in the shoes of a foreign leader, even a completely neutral one, I'm looking at that and seeing a glaring, flashing red warning light.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm realizing that the guy who owns the pipes can turn off my country's drinking water whenever he disagrees with my foreign policy.
That is the exact realization sweeping the globe. So to protect their sovereign national security, countries are actively choosing inefficiency. They are choosing fragmentation.
They're subsidizing their own industry.
Yes, which is what industrial policy is, even if it costs 3 times as much to produce a solar panel or a microchip domestically, just to ensure they control the supply. Our sources bring up Patrick Boyle's analysis on the real reason European cars can't compete. It touches perfectly on this dynamic.
Oh, what's his take?
You have legacy European auto industries trapped between expensive domestic production mandates designed to protect local jobs and a flood of cheaper foreign imports that are heavily state subsidized by rival powers like China.
Okay, let me jump in here because I want to look at this through a generational lens for a minute.
Yeah.
If governments being back in the business of business means we are reshoring manufacturing and building our own stuff again, is that actually a bad thing for the average worker?
Well,
Let's think about it. If you are an older millennial or Gen X, you came of age in that hyper-globalized, optimistic 1990s era where factories were leaving the US and Europe in droves.
right.
But if you are Gen Z or Gen Alpha today, you are entering a world defined by resource scarcity and walled-off domestic economies. Does financial fragmentation actually mean more jobs at home?
That's the question.
Yeah, like if we are forced to build our own microchips and manufacture our own medical supplies because we don't trust global supply chains anymore, doesn't that create a massive boom in domestic employment despite the macro $6 trillion cost to global GDP?
That is the fundamental paradox of industrial policy, and it's a vital question. Yes, in theory, reshoring manufacturing creates local jobs. You build a new semiconductor plant in Arizona. You need construction workers, engineers, factory line workers.
Yeah, good jobs.
But remember the trade-off. The globalized system kept consumer prices incredibly artificially low for 30 years. When you force production back home to a higher wage economy, you are paying for a security premium. Goods become fundamentally more expensive to produce.
So the Gen Z worker gets a job at the new domestic factory, but the purchasing power of their paycheck is immediately degraded by the inflation that reshoring causes.
Precisely. The $6 trillion hit isn't just a conceptual loss of multinational corporate profits. It represents the very real increased cost of everything due to supply chain redundancy. It's inflation baked into the cake. You might have a more secure job, but the widget you are building now costs 3 times as much at the local store, your rent is higher, and your groceries are more expensive.
That makes a lot of sense. You secure the domestic labor market, but you lose the purchasing power. Now, if the West is driving a large part of this fragmentation through industrial policy and the weaponization of the dollar, we have to look at how the rest of the world is reacting.
Because they aren't just sitting still.
No. If the West is weaponizing the dollar, the countries reliant on it must be looking for lifeboats. Is that what's driving this sudden, massive push toward de-dollarization?
It is the primary driver, and this is where the divides truly deepen. The Oliver Wyman report explicitly warns about the severe, disproportionate consequences for emerging markets in particular.
Okay.
This is why the WEF panel prominently features Daniel Evaminala. As the chairman of Nedbank, which is one of the largest financial institutions in South Africa, he brings a crucial perspective from the global south. Emerging economies are the ones taking the brunt of this fragmentation.
Why are emerging markets so uniquely vulnerable to a broken plumbing system?
Let's walk through the mechanics of emerging market debt. Historically, emerging markets rely heavily on the U.S. dollar for international trade pricing commodities like oil, and crucially, to service their national debts.
Right.
If an emerging African or South American nation wants to borrow money to build infrastructure, international investors usually demand the debt be denominated in U.S. dollars because they trust the dollar's stability over the local currency.
Okay, so they owe dollars.
Right. Now, when global instability hits like Cold War, heating up capital historically flees emerging markets and rushes to the perceived safety of the U.S. dollar.
Which drives up the price of the dollar.
Exactly. This massive demand for dollars causes the dollar's value to spike globally. But if you are an emerging market, your tax revenue is collected in your local currency.
Oh, I see.
If your local currency collapses against the dollar, suddenly paying back your dollar-denominated national debt requires twice as much of your local currency. And importing food and energy, which are priced in dollars, becomes exponentially more expensive. It creates a sovereign debt doom loop.
So they are completely caught in the crossfire. They are suffering from inflation imported directly from Western geopolitical friction.
They are. They are being forced to navigate between increasingly fragmented hostile systems, which adds massive compliance and transaction costs to their already fragile economies. So logically, they are looking for a way out. They want to bypass the dollar entirely.
Right.
This brings us to the insights from Einar Tangen, included in our sources, focusing on China's digital currency and de-dollarization.
We also have headlines in the sources screaming about a global monetary reset and gold's bloodbath. Let's break down the digital currency aspect first. I'm struggling to visualize this. How does a digital currency actually bypass the traditional SWIFT plumbing we talked about earlier?
Well, think back to the correspondent banking system. You need SWIFT to send secure messages between intermediary banks. A central bank digital currency, or CBDC, fundamentally alters that architecture by utilizing distributed ledger technology similar to blockchain. If China, for example, successfully internationalizes a digital yuan, they can set up bilateral agreements with other nations. Two countries could theoretically trade directly with each other, settling transactions instantly on a shared digital ledger.
So instead of routing a payment through a Western intermediary bank where it could be sanctioned or frozen, they just update a digital ledger between the two of them.
Yes. Let's look at it this way. The traditional SWIFT system is the main state highway. It's fast, it's paved, but there are toll booths operated by the U.S. and Europe. If they don't like your license plate, they drop the boom gate and seize your car.
Right, that's a great analogy.
A CBDC international network is like you and your neighbors realizing the highway is compromised, so you secretly pave a private dirt road directly connecting your backyards. It might not have the massive volume capacity of the highway yet, but the toll operators have zero jurisdiction over it.
It renders the traditional Western sanctions toolkit completely obsolete.
It does. And it's not just digital alternatives they're pursuing. Our sources highlight a massive flight to physical, stateless assets, too.
Like gold.
Exactly. We have discussions from Andy Sheckman analyzing the COMEX gold and silver drain. He argues that the paper price of gold, the price you see ticker taping on financial news, is a misdirection, while the actual physical bullion is being aggressively accumulated and removed from Western vaults by central banks in the East.
Let me stop you there. What exactly is the COMEX, and why does a drain matter?
The COMEX is the primary futures and options market for trading metals like gold and silver. For decades, the vast majority of trading on the COMEX has been paper trading.
Meaning?
Investors buy and sell contracts representing gold, betting on the price movement, without ever intending to take physical delivery of the metal. There is far more paper gold traded than there is physical gold sitting in the vault.
Ah, so it's a system built on trust. Everyone assumes that if they wanted the physical gold, they could get it, so nobody actually asks for it.
Exactly. But what Skechtman and other analysts are pointing out is a fundamental shift in behavior. Eastern central banks, particularly the BRICS nations, are no longer content holding paper contracts or U.S. Treasury bonds that can be frozen.
They want the real thing.
They are buying gold and demanding physical delivery. They are pulling it out of the COMEX and shipping it to their own sovereign vaults. Felix and friends also discuss this in the context of gold's bloodbath, analyzing what happens to the global fiat system when trust evaporates.
Because when trust in the digital plumbing evaporates, you return to the most foundational, uncancelable money in human history.
Yeah.
Physical gold.
Yes.
It sounds like they're hoarding gold to potentially back their own alternative trading systems because they no longer trust the digital paper promises of the West.
What's fascinating here is the profound irony. By attempting to weaponize the financial system through aggressive anti-financial crime measures and sanctions, the West has accidentally accelerated the system's fragmentation.
They basically forced their hand.
They have provided the ultimate incentive for their adversaries and even some neutral emerging markets to rapidly build, test, and deploy alternative plumbing.
Let's look at the generational impact of this on a global scale.
Hmm.
If you look at global demographics right now, the countries with the oldest, rapidly shrinking populations are largely in the West Europe, Japan, parts of the U.S.
Yeah.
But the countries with the youngest populations, massive youth bulges, are in emerging markets, particularly across Africa and parts of Asia. If the economies with the youngest populations cannot grow because the global financial plumbing is fragmented, what happens?
It gets ugly.
Like if they are starved of capital because they are stuck on the wrong side of Cold War II, how does that impact the future?
It creates an unprecedented geopolitical pressure cooker. If you have a massive, young, technologically connected population in the global south that is structurally locked out of global capital flows, the resulting economic stagnation breeds desperation.
Yeah.
You are stunting the economic potential of the largest demographic cohort on the planet. The historical outcome of that scenario is severe political instability, the collapse of local governments, and massive, uncontrollable migration waves as young people physically move to where the capital is hoarded.
It's a demographic time bomb triggered by a financial administrative crisis.
Mhm.
Okay, let's bring this all the way back home. We've looked at the grand geopolitics. We've looked at the global south and the east.
Let's look at the domestic picture.
Exactly. Let's pivot to how this multi-trillion-dollar fragmentation hits domestic populations directly in their wallets. We need to dissect inflation, the AI bubble, and the new type of market crash our sources are warning about.
This is the point where the macroeconomic plumbing issues finally flood the domestic living room. The sources we have paint a picture of severe structural domestic fragility in 2026.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Well, we have the legendary financial observer Jim Grant explicitly stating, the next crash won't look like 2008. We have Stanford's Darrell Duffy detailing how the Federal Reserve could shrink trillions from its balance sheet. And perhaps most provocatively, we have former Federal Reserve Governor Kevin Warsh asserting that inflation is a choice.
Let's start right there with Warsh's comment. Inflation is a choice. That is a heavily loaded statement. Because if inflation is a choice, it implies that the people at the central banks are actively deciding to let prices run hot.
It does.
Why on earth would they choose to inflict inflation on their own citizens?
To answer that, we have to look at the math of sovereign debt. The U.S. government, much like many Western governments post-COVID, is carrying a historically staggering amount of national debt.
Trillions.
Right. When a government has record high debt relative to its GDP, there are really only three ways out. First, you default, which destroys your currency and credit rating catastrophic. Second, you grow your way out through explosive organic GDP growth, which is highly unlikely in a fragmented, inefficient world where global trade is slowing down.
Which leaves option 3.
Option 3 is financial repression. You inflate the debt away. Let's walk through the mechanics. If a government owes $1 trillion and they allow inflation to run high, the cost of goods and services rises.
Okay.
As a result, wages eventually rise, and therefore tax revenues naturally increase because people are paying taxes on higher nominal incomes. The government is collecting more tax dollars, but the principal debt remains fixed at $1 trillion.
So they are effectively paying back old debt with Newly printed, devalued money.
Precisely. By letting inflation run slightly higher than the interest rates they pay on the debt, the real value of that debt shrinks over time. It is a hidden tax on anyone holding cash or fixed income assets. They are choosing inflation because it is the politically easiest way to manage an unpayable debt burden.
So to pay for the massive debts racked up during the hyper-globalized era and to fund this new, wildly expensive industrial policy of reshoring factories for Cold War II, they are choosing to let inflation run hot.
Yes,
But how does this tie into Jim Grant's warning that the next crash won't look like 2008?
because the baseline reality has changed. In 2008, the crash was inherently deflationary. Credit disappeared, the value of assets plummeted, and no one was spending money. The Federal Reserve could safely respond by dropping interest rates to zero and printing trillions of dollars quantitative easing without immediately sparking hyperinflation because there was a massive lack of demand in the system.
But if the baseline reality in 2026 is structurally high inflation driven by supply chain fragmentation and intentional financial repression, the Fed's hands are tied.
Exactly. The Fed cannot simply print money to save the system when something breaks in 2026. If they try to flush the pipes with more liquidity while inflation is already running hot, inflation will spiral completely out of control, destroying the currency.
Wow.
So the next crash Jim Grant is talking about is likely a crisis of sovereign debt and currency value rather than a banking credit freeze. It's a crash where nominal stock prices or house prices might actually stay high, but the purchasing power of the currency evaporates.
This connects directly to Daryl Duffy's analysis in the sources about the Fed shrinking its balance sheet. Let's explain that, because shrinking the balance sheet sounds like corporate jargon. How does the Fed actually pull money out of the economy?
It's a process called quantitative tightening, or QT. During the good times, the Fed bought trillions of dollars of government bonds to inject cash into the banking system. To shrink the balance sheet, they do the reverse. When those bonds mature, instead of taking the repayment and buying new bonds, the Fed simply lets the bonds expire and removes that money from the financial system entirely. It effectively makes money disappear, which drains liquidity from the banking sector, making loans harder to get and interest rates higher.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we have to map out how this exact macroeconomic cocktail high structural inflation mixed with the central bank draining liquidity impacts everyday individuals across different generations.
Right.
Let's start with the older demographics, boomers and Gen X. One of our sources is a deep dive from a group called the Retirement Nerds, titled Social Security at 62 versus 70, the math everyone gets wrong. In a world of fragmented finance and chosen inflation, how does this change the retirement playbook?
It turns the traditional math completely upside down. For decades, financial advisors debated taking Social Security early at age 62 versus waiting for maximum monthly benefits at age 70.
That was the standard advice, right?
Yeah.
Just wait.
Right. It was mostly a straightforward calculation based on your life expectancy and assumed compound interest. But if you introduce structural, persistent inflation, the kind driven by global supply chains breaking down, the purchasing power of a fixed income is devastated.
Let's run a hypothetical scenario to really ground this. Let's invent a guy. Call him Bob. Bob is 62 years old in 2026. He's looking at his options. If he retires now, he gets, say, $2,000 a month. If he waits until 70, he might get $3,000 a month. Historically, everyone says wait for the $3,000. But what happens to Bob in this new paradigm?
In our fragmented inflationary paradigm, Bob has a major problem. Older generations rely heavily on bonds and fixed income assets for safety. In a high inflation environment, those safe assets bleed real value every single day because their yield doesn't keep up with inflation.
Ouch.
If Bob locks in his $2,000 at 62, yes, it's a lower nominal amount. But what if inflation runs at 6% or 7% for the next 8 years due to reshoring costs and the Fed inflating away the debt?
By the time Bob hits 70, that $3,000 a month he was waiting for might actually buy fewer groceries than the $2,000 did when he was 62. He's racing against the rapid devaluation of the currency itself.
Exactly. The Retirement Nerds math highlights that in a structurally inflationary environment, delaying Social Security might mean you are getting paid in heavily devalued dollars later while sacrificing the purchasing power you could have utilized today.
That is terrifying.
This anxiety is profoundly destabilizing. It brings in author Neil Howe, featured in our sources, discussing America's looming civic transformation.
Neil Howe is famous for his fourth turning theory, right? The idea that history moves in 80-year generational cycles of crisis and rebuilding.
Yes. For boomers and Gen X, who built their wealth, their investment portfolios, and their retirement expectations during an era of stable prices, falling interest rates, and global integration, this fragmented inflationary crisis feels like the sudden unwinding of the fundamental social contract.
Now let's flip the coin to millennials and Gen Z. If older generations are battling inflation on their fixed incomes, younger generations are facing a crisis in the primary growth sectors, where they have concentrated their careers and investments.
Specifically, the technology sector.
Yeah, our sources include a stark warning from billionaire Ray Dalio. AI bubble will burst eventually. We also have another billionaire on the diary of a CEO declaring, "I'm selling. The crash is already here." Why is AI vulnerable to this plumbing crisis? Everyone assumes AI is the unstoppable future.
AI is undeniably transformative, but let's analyze Dalio's warning about the bubble through the lens of our fragmented financial plumbing. Developing artificial intelligence is unbelievably capital-intensive.
It takes so much money.
It requires massive amounts of physical energy, highly sophisticated and expensive semiconductors, and tens of billions of dollars in continuous speculative investment to build massive data centers. For the last few years, AI has been the speculative darling of the stock market, sucking up all the available cheap capital.
It's where all the younger generations are flocking, hoping to find career growth, equity compensation, and wealth creation.
But look at the macroeconomic environment we just outlined. If the global financial plumbing fractures, trade slows down, and capital becomes expensive. Crucially, if the Fed is busy shrinking its balance sheet quantitative tightening, they are actively draining liquidity out of the market.
Right?
Suddenly, funding these massive, highly speculative AI data centers with cheap debt becomes financially untenable.
The cheap money tap gets turned off.
Dalio is pointing out that eventually the market will stop paying for the promise of AI and will violently demand actual proportionate revenue and profit from these massive investments.
Which they might not have yet.
Right. When that speculative bubble bursts, the economic fallout won't primarily hit legacy manufacturing plants in the Rust Belt. It will squarely hit the tech-heavy 401ks, the venture capital valuations, and the career trajectories of millennials and Gen Z.
I have to admit, I look at my own retirement portfolio, which is heavily weighted in big tech and AI-adjacent companies, and hearing Ray Dalio say this bubble is going to burst precisely because the underlying capital liquidity will dry up, it changes how I view my entire financial future.
It's a huge perspective shift.
But let me push back on this whole scenario for a minute, because looking at this across the generations, it feels incredibly relentlessly bleak.
It is a sobering picture, without a doubt.
Like, if inflation is a choice by the central banks to save themselves from sovereign debt, and the AI bubble bursts, destroying young tech wealth, aren't we just setting up a scenario where younger generations take the absolute brunt of the hit?
Right.
They lose their jobs in the tech crash, they can't afford houses because of inflation, while older generations essentially pressure policymakers to protect their inflated legacy assets. Is outright generational warfare the inevitable outcome of this financial fragmentation?
It's a deeply concerning read of the situation, and it really aligns with historical precedents. When the overall economic pie shrinks, which is exactly what a $6 trillion global GDP loss implies, the fight over the remaining slices becomes visceral.
Right.
Neil Howe's concept of a civic transformation usually involves a painful period where institutional trust completely collapses precisely because different demographics realize the system is mathematically rigged against them.
So the fragmentation is domestic too.
Yes. The financial fragmentation isn't just happening between the US, China, and the global South. It is actively fragmenting the domestic social contract between the young and the old.
Okay, with such a grim outlook across all age groups and geographies, we have to ask, what, if anything, can mitigate a $6 trillion catastrophe? The WEF presentation explicitly asks the question, can the impacts be mitigated?
And they point toward innovation, specifically referencing a report on the top 10 emerging technologies 2026.
Okay, how does that help?
If the traditional municipal plumbing is cracking under pressure, mitigation means inventing entirely new ways to move the water. This is where emerging technologies transition from speculative novelties to vital infrastructure.
Like the CBDCs we talked about.
Exactly. We discussed earlier how CBDCs are being used defensively by adversarial nations. But blockchain technology, distributed ledgers, and the tokenization of real-world assets could be the tools that private markets use to patch the system.
I want to dig into the private markets aspect. Matt Strahan from the WEF is the private market initiative's lead. I'm struggling to visualize this in practice. If I'm a massive multinational corporation, I still have to pay taxes in local fiat currency. I still have to pay employees in dollars or euros.
Right.
How can private markets bypass state-level broken systems? How does a corporation just become its own bank?
It's a fascinating evolution. When sovereign governments build walls, private capital inevitably finds tunnels. Even if the US and China are in a deep geoeconomic Cold War, multinational corporations still need to optimize their supply chains and allocate capital efficiently to survive.
They still have to make money.
Exactly. What we may see is a massive rise in highly localized private financial networks.
Give me an example of how that works.
Imagine a massive global supply chain logistics company. Instead of routing every single cross-border payment between their subsidiaries through the heavily monitored, slow, and expensive SWIFT system, they might utilize decentralized, AI-managed distributed ledgers.
Okay.
They can tokenize their internal assets and use this private ledger to net out their global trades internally. They only interact with the traditional fragmented state-level plumbing when absolutely necessary, like paying local taxes.
Oh, I see.
For everything else, they essentially clear their own trades internally, minimizing their exposure to the geopolitical friction.
So they create proprietary, highly efficient microsystems to insulate themselves from the $6 trillion macro inefficiency. It's like building a self-sustaining water recycling system inside your own house so you don't have to rely on the broken city mains.
Precisely. But this raises a profound philosophical question for the future of finance. Is mitigation just a temporary patch on a dying system?
What do you mean?
Well, if we look at Neil Howe's cyclical view of history, perhaps this fragmentation is an inevitable, necessary cycle of creative destruction. Maybe true mitigation doesn't mean trying to desperately duct tape the hyper-globalized 1990s system back together, because that system was clearly too fragile and vulnerable to these geopolitical shocks.
Right.
Maybe mitigation means accepting and adapting to a new, structurally multipolar financial reality.
Wow. So what does this all mean for us at the end of the day? We've covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started with a staggering $6 trillion warning from the WEF and Oliver Wyman about the global financial plumbing breaking apart.
Yeah.
We explored how the return of geoeconomics and Cold War II are driving nations to prioritize national security over economic efficiency. We saw how that friction is leading to a massive push for de-dollarization, alternative digital ledgers, and a rush for physical gold in the global south. And we brought it all the way down to your living room, examining how this macro fragmentation forces central banks into impossible choices regarding inflation, fundamentally altering the retirement math for boomers, and threatening the capital-intensive AI career trajectories of Gen Z and Millennials.
The essential through line here is that the era of invisible, reliable global financial plumbing is definitively over. The friction is now visible, and the costs are materializing in every aspect of the economy. The choices being made right now by institutions like the Federal Reserve and the shifts in global industrial policy are actively writing the economic reality for all of us.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to chew on. We've talked extensively about how nation-states and massive multinational corporations might adapt to this fragmentation. But what about individuals?
Yeah, where does that leave everyone else?
Exactly. If the global financial plumbing completely shatters, dividing the world into isolated, heavily monitored, deeply inflationary economic islands, will future generations eventually abandon the concept of sovereign fiat currency entirely?
It's a huge question.
If you are a young person looking at the year 2050, could you rely instead on a hyper-localized digital barter system, a system rooted entirely in verifiable community trust and AI-managed local resources, completely detached from national central banks? Could the very idea of global finance one day be looked back upon by future generations as an obsolete, chaotic relic of the past? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the information around you, and we'll see you next time.